Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Dan Feldman, man, it's nice to get you on. I appreciate you coming on. I kind of roped you because I wanted to make sure I got an episode in for everybody. And well, you're better known, maybe known as the powerlifting dietitian. That's your Instagram. And you're an RD, Master of Science, a lot of education, very evidence-based. And you're one of my favorite people for diving into studies on nutrition, training stuff, and separating truth from myth. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I know you're going to be soft-spoken, but I'm going to light you up here and we're going to dive right into it. So I was going through your social media. There's all sorts of good stuff there. So some people think carbs equals diabetes. That's a recent post. Right. So where does this oversimplified idea come from? What's the truth?
Right. So the I guess kind of where that myth comes from is that ultimately diabetes is a disease characterized by high blood sugar, high blood glucose. It's diagnosed by either based on fasting blood sugar or something called an oral glucose tolerance test. That's basically when they have someone drink a very sugary beverage and then they look at their blood sugar response to that. And if it stays too high too long, that can be used to diagnose diabetes, or something called HbA1c, which is another way to assess kind of average blood glucose. So basically, to diagnose diabetes, it's based on your blood sugar. And eating food, specifically mainly eating carbohydrates, does increase your blood sugar. So to some extent, that's probably where that myth comes from. And, people who eat a lot of very sugary foods, who just eat unhealthily in general, and, eating a diet that's very high in sugary foods is going to kind of constitute that, will be more at risk for diabetes. But, as you alluded to, it's definitely not that simple, because diabetes, and I'll specify type 2 diabetes here. Type 1 is usually starts when someone is very young. It's more of a genetic component. Type 2 diabetes, it's caused by a variety of factors. One of the biggest ones, maybe the biggest, is obesity specifically. So if someone has excess body fat, especially excess body fat around their midsection, that increases their risk for something called insulin resistance. So insulin basically is, so you eat food and your blood sugar goes up, and we have this hormone called insulin, which works to reduce the blood sugar. People who have insulin resistance, the insulin, the person's body doesn't respond to that insulin as well because they're resistant to it, so the blood sugar stays elevated. That's kind of an oversimplification, but I'll go with it. So having a lot of body fat, especially body fat around the midsection, is one of the key players in that insulin resistance. And there's also like a variety of other things. So not exercising enough also is a big one. So exercising, especially resistance training, is really good for, insulin sensitivity. Obviously, there's genetic factors and race and ethnicity. So certain ethnicities tend to be at a higher risk. There's some evidence that even excessive saturated fat intake, might play a role to some extent. So there's really a lot of different factors, like I said, that result in that insulin resistance and then that type 2 diabetes. So it's not just like a carbs causes diabetes. In the acute sense, eating carbs does increase your blood sugar. But when it comes to that insulin resistance, there's really a whole host of factors, there. And if it were the case that just eating more carbs would lead to diabetes, we would see people with the highest carbohydrate intakes all have diabetes. And that's not necessarily what we see in the research. So, and another kind of point to that is, a lot of folks, you see kind of like a lot of tribalism with regard to different diets, like low carb, for example. So when folks who maybe have a low carb bias, see a mechanism by which, carbs increase blood sugar, they're going to really jump on that. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's not that simple. It's just eating carbs causes
Those people
diabetes.
also deny the fact that, you take a whey protein shake and that increases your insulin, right?
It does. It does.
So insulin's a complex hormone, but it's in
Right.
response to something, and it's more of a byproduct of something much greater than itself the cause of diabetes.
Correct, correct. So, and again, there's kind of a lot of nuance here, but essentially, when your blood sugar increases, that signals to your body to create more insulin, and the insulin helps to shuttle that blood sugar into your cells, so it decreases your blood sugar to a normal level. And in people with insulin resistance, that doesn't really quite work. There's issues there, so we need to produce more insulin to reduce blood sugar, and it's kind of this ongoing cycle. So, yeah, and it's not like insulin is like inherently bad. I see all kinds of people saying that it's actually an essential hormone. Yeah, it's definitely kind of more complex than a lot of the folks who are on that kind of low carb bandwagon tend to claim.
And if I'm not mistaken, I might be oversimplifying, but if you are resistance training, then insulin will preferentially shuttle glucose, amino acids, protein, things like creatine into muscle cells
Mhm.
versus necessarily body fat. If you're inactive, well, there's less demand for glucose in your muscle cells. So therefore, it gets shuttled into body fat, right? Because there's nowhere else for it to go.
Yeah, yeah. So doing more resistance training so if you do like a set of bicep curls, for example, when you are working your biceps in that way, it will increase the insulin sensitivity of your bicep muscles. So it'll allow those muscles to more easily respond to insulin and to kind of soak up that blood glucose. And, to some extent, that's why resistance training in particular is really good for diabetes management or for controlling blood sugar. I mean, really any exercise is good for that. And obviously exercise burns calories and helps with weight loss. You could go on and on for hours about how great resistance training is, but yeah, resistance training, especially because of that effect it has on the muscles, really is very good for that insulin sensitivity to the muscle that you're working specifically.
What do you say to someone who has read a book like let's say The Obesity Code, which is a popular
Mhm.
book, Dr. Jason Fung, he's a Canadian nephrologist.
Right.
And I mean, I will clearly say that I think he's probably one of the greatest perpetuators of this myth of the carb insulin hypothesis. So, what do you say to someone who reads that book and goes, wow, that's really compelling? That makes a lot of sense. This guy's a doctor.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of doctors who say a lot of things that are not necessarily accurate. And we would just kind of have to look at is this actually something that plays out in the research? And again, if it was like carbohydrates were the cause of all of this, then people who have the highest carbohydrate intakes would thereby have the highest rates of diabetes, right? And we just don't see that. And more broadly, I would tell someone like that, I would tell someone like that we have to be careful, and this is tough, but we have to be careful of who we listen to in kind of the nutrition-based space, because there's a lot of folks who have legitimate or somewhat legitimate credentials, PhDs, MDs, some RDs, who say things that sometimes there's a kernel of truth to them. Oftentimes it's based on mechanistic studies, but oftentimes there's a kernel of truth and there's enough kind of jargon so that it makes sense. But it's almost like focusing on the wrong thing and it doesn't really bear out, in the real world. So again, at the end of the day, when it comes to, blood sugar control, preventing type 2 diabetes, it's not that obesity is the only factor, but maintaining a healthy body weight, regular exercise, uh, sleeping adequately. I know these things sound boring. Actually, not regular sleep deprivation also can reduce insulin sensitivity. So to a large extent, it's going to kind of be the stuff that sounds boring and obvious that are going to be most important there. Um,
What do you say to the
so yeah.
person who, let's say they are categorically obese, right?
Mhm.
And on one side of the spectrum, they're hearing, okay, there's a relationship between, your level of adiposity and your risk of things like diabetes and other lifestyle disease. And on the other side of the spectrum, you actually have people who are saying there is no relationship between adiposity and your risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So on one side, you've got someone who's really stressed out and worried about it. On the other side, you're getting this message that says, hey, you have nothing to worry about. What do you say to
Right.
that person?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would tell them that, I mean, we do have a lot of evidence that past a certain threshold, obesity, especially abdominal obesity, is directly linked to increased risk of dying. All cause mortality risk is directly linked to heart disease risk, is directly linked to certain types of cancer, is directly linked to type 2 diabetes. So, we have all of this data. Now, that being said, that's not to say that someone needs to be super lean or needs to look like a bodybuilder or anything like that to be healthy. There is kind of some middle ground where someone can certainly have an elevated BMI, whether it be, elevated BMI because they've got a lot of muscle, right? So BMI basically just looks at your height and weight and tries to determine how fat you are. So that's, obviously limited. So someone could be obese or overweight and actually just have a lot of muscle, but someone might have more adipose tissue, more fat tissue than might kind of be optimal kind of from our eyes, or based on kind of medical standards. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to drop dead. So we need to kind of have nuanced conversations. And to that person, it's also important to have a level of compassion, where you're honest with kind of risk factors and whatnot, but, you're not also shaming them for their body weight. You know what I mean? So I really think it's just about having that honest conversation. And the idea that any level of adiposity, any level of obesity, just doesn't affect your risk at all is just insane to me. And I mean, there certainly are many instances in which taking a weight neutral approach can be overall beneficial for health, but that doesn't take away the fact that obesity past a certain threshold. Again, if someone has a BMI of exactly 30, which is the cutoff for obesity, doesn't necessarily mean they're always at increased risk. Generally, I tell people, if you're kind of in that kind of category, assess your waist circumference. That tends to be a pretty decent marker of disease risk. Generally less than 40 inches for men, 35 inches for women, and then get regular labs checked, your cholesterol, your blood sugar, or A1C, which, like I said, is just a long-term marker of blood sugar, triglycerides, and blood pressure, stuff like that. If all that's within normal range and your waist circumference is in a reasonable range, you're probably okay. And again, it comes back to also treating the individual, not necessarily looking at like numbers on a paper, and making sure you're having that compassionate approach with them as well. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And isn't it true that even losing a small percentage of body fat can
Hmm.
actually substantially lower risk? Now, is that it probably has more to do with the fact that if someone's lost the body fat, they probably have changed lifestyle behavior, changed what they're eating, and maybe they're more active. And so
Yeah.
we know that, someone's activity level, especially if they're regularly resistance training, regularly doing, zone 2 cardio type stuff, that's going to have tremendous benefit here, right?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So it's not like someone has to go from, you know, if they are a BMI of like 40, and again, like I said, the BMI cutoff of 30 is what's obese. It's not like someone has to go from 40 to 25, which is the cutoff for overweight in order to be healthy. If they even lose, like you said, 5% of their body weight or 10%, that will still have a meaningful effect on their risk for long-term disease and early death. It'll have a beneficial effect. If they already have some of that insulin resistance, like I was talking about, it will likely improve it. It'll reduce their risk for, some of the diseases that I mentioned, like heart disease, stroke, etc. So there's definitely kind of room for that middle ground. Someone doesn't necessarily have to go to, you know, uh, um, shredded lean, or like looking like a Sports Illustrated model or what have you to improve their health.
All right. So let's go further here. So
Hmm.
everybody's hearing a lot of nasty stuff about high fructose corn syrup. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, you said that high fructose corn syrup is no worse or better than cane sugar or honey. Now, this is sort of, I don't want to get political, but it's sort of in the political discourse right now. You're American, I'm Canadian. So, like, it's kind
Sure.
of a thing. And so, what are the implications here? Because we know we have, quote, wellness influencers, many of whom the evidence-based community are very critical of, who are basically demonizing high fructose corn syrup. And then they're
Yeah.
saying things like they want to replace it, ban it, and just replace it with things like cane sugar. Is that going to change anything?
No, I don't think it will. So high fructose corn syrup, cane sugar, honey, they're all very similar. They're all sugars. They all are disaccharides, which are basically types of sugars that contain two molecules. Di is two, right? And so they basically contain one part of glucose, one part fructose. Okay, the high fructose corn syrup, it's only got slightly more fructose than glucose. It's got 55% fructose, whereas regular sugar, cane sugar, it's got 50%. So people hear high fructose and they're like, "Oh my God, fructose, it's terrible." But it's really quite similar there. You know what I mean? So it's not going to really make a huge difference. And there are actually specific studies that have actually compared regular sugar, maybe not cane sugar, but table sugar, sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup and honey, compare them, and there really isn't that much difference. Now, I'm not saying that high fructose corn syrup is good. Sim Eating too much just kind of simple sugar, whether it be, table sugar or, like I said, cane sugar or high fructose corn syrup or agave nectar or honey, eating too much of that is bad. And not necessarily, and really it's more so bad because it results in an increase in overall calorie intake, right? Eating a lot of foods that are very high in, simple sugars, that's generally going to result in an increase in overall calorie intake, and obesity, and then that causes a lot of problems. Oftentimes food with all that's very dense in sugar, high fructose corn syrup, etc. Oftentimes is not the most nutritious food in the world. You're going to tend to find high fructose corn syrup, but things that are more heavily processed, less nutritious, etc. But it's not necessarily the high fructose corn syrup that's an issue. And also, again, like I said, even though it's only slightly more fructose, people hear high fructose and they think it's bad because they think fructose is bad, which is not necessarily the case. Fructose consumed in very high amounts does have some unique, it is, fructose is handled by the body in kind of a unique way. It's more so metabolized in the liver, whereas as your other type of simple sugar, the glucose, is more so in kind of like your whole body. So if we consume way too much fructose, that can play a role in excess liver fat, right? But like I said, one high fructose corn syrup, it's only got slightly more fructose. And also, all of those problems that I mentioned really are only relevant if you're in a chronic calorie surplus. Because if you're not in a calorie surplus, all of the extra energy that you consume from high fructose corn syrup, from, cane sugar, from honey, or if you just are weird and have a bottle of fructose that you consume, if you are in a, yeah, if you aren't in a calorie surplus, you're going to burn all of that because you're at either a calorie maintenance, which means you are burning all of the energy that you're taking in, or a deficit, which means you're burning more energy than you're taking in. So all of that is getting burned. So you're not going to be having the liver fat that people worry about with, fructose, or you're not really going to have any issues here. So I know it sounds kind of redundant, but, unless you're in a calorie surplus, a sustained calorie surplus, it's not really going to matter that much. So
You
yeah,
pretty
so
much said it. It's like
yeah,
if you're consuming a lot of ultra processed food, which oftentimes have high fructose corn syrup, it's
yeah,
a lot easier to be at a calorie surplus and therefore
yeah,
gain adiposity. So all these things come together. I mean, it's like it's the calories. It has always been the calories.
yeah. And I'm to play devil's advocate. There are people out there who, so high fructose corn syrup, I don't remember exactly when it was kind of first kind of introduced in the food supply. I want to say the 60s, 70s, 80s. Could
Mm.
be wrong. I know that's kind of a big range, but there are people who say, hey, high fructose corn syrup, it's simpler to produce than regular sugar, which is why it was introduced, right?
And
And
subsidized
then
and government subsidized often enough, right? It's cheap.
I believe so. I believe
Yes,
so. It's
I
very
think
it's
so.
very cheap. Yeah, it's very cheap to produce, which is part of why it was introduced in the food supply. And there are people
Mm.
that will say, hey, because it's so cheap to produce, that resulted in more foods that are just more sugary in general, and then that caused issues with our food with food supply being more obesogenic. Okay, like that. As long as it's not like the high fructose corn syrup in and of itself, but just there being more hyper palatable food. So that just means food that's very, very tasty and easy to overeat. If you want to make that argument, that's fair. But it's not really the high fructose corn syrup itself. And I would even go a step further to say it's not necessarily processed food in and of itself, but it's the fact that these foods that happen to contain high fructose corn syrup or happen to be highly processed are very easy to overeat. They're very calorie dense. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes they aren't as high in important micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. And then that leads to overconsumption. So again, it's coming down to the overall calories and the overconsumption. Some of the people with the highest fructose corn syrup, sorry, some of the people with the highest fructose consumption are ultra endurance athletes. You know what I mean? They're constantly taking like gels and gummies that are pretty high in sugar and fructose. You don't see them walking around with high levels of liver fat or high levels of metabolic disease or type 2 diabetes because they're burning it all, right? So again, if you're managing your overall calorie intake, again, it's kind of like a theme. That's really what's key.
And that population, that cohort has very high VO2 max, and that
Right.
is a very, very strong like correlate causal thing when it comes to longevity and health span. So
Yeah.
there's strong evidence that that group live long lives and generally healthier lives.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So kind of getting back to your original kind of question about replacing high fructose corn syrup with cane sugar, it's not it is if it's the same food that's as calorie dense and as sugary, I don't think it would make that much of a difference. The only, again, playing devil's advocate, I'm not trying to get into
Mm.
politics, playing devil's advocate, if you had a scenario in which by replacing the high fructose corn syrup with cane sugar, it suddenly made those foods much more expensive. I guess there's a mechanism there, but then I would still question like what is it being replaced by? You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So yeah, but strictly if you were to just take someone's diet and just replace all the high fructose corn syrup with cane sugar, keep everything else the same, nothing's going to change.
I mean, this is why I brought you on.
Yeah.
Evidence-based but nuanced answers. Like, I'm hoping everybody listening has been enjoying these episodes and kind of going, okay, cool. This is not like sensational hyperbolic claims. This actually gets into the nuts and bolts. And it's kind of funny. You went in somewhere, there was another post you had and about like fruit and people,
Fruit.
there's literally still people
Yeah.
talking about fruit being bad for you. So you probably already half answered it as to kind of
Yeah.
where this comes from. But like, why does this claim still exist? And, what's the evidence,
Yes.
behind that claim or the fact that what's the evidence to suggest that fruit is really healthy?
A lot of it comes back to the idea that fruit is bad. Sorry, that fructose is bad. Pardon me. Like I said, the idea of fructose being bad, a lot of that has to do with the fact that fructose, like I said, is largely metabolized in the liver. So if you consume too much of fructose, then that can have implications with liver fat, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And fructose is so fruit is relatively high in sugar, not compared to really sugary foods and sweets and stuff, but it is, largely sugar. And a large portion of it depends on the fruit, but a large amount of the sugar that's in it is fructose. So that is largely where people kind of get the idea that like fruit is bad for you. It usually comes down to fructose. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that is nonsense. One, it kind of, I tell people that if something sounds like very off and it doesn't really jive with common sense, it's probably not accurate. So the idea of telling people, hey, fruit is actually really bad for you or vegetables really bad for you, like it kind of doesn't pass the sniff test. But for one, if you look at population level data, and I know you and Joey Munoz talked a bit about this,
Yes.
and he talked about like, hey, just look at the actual data, and to that point, people with the highest levels of fruit intake tend to live a lot longer, fruits and vegetables, right? So with fruit, the biggest thing, and you'll notice a theme here, most whole fruits are very low in calories. So even though like a large portion of the calories from fruit comes from sugar. That's what I meant when when I said it's relatively high in sugar.
Mm.
Most of the calories, or many of the calories in fruit, is coming from sugar, fructose, etc. Fruit itself, for most fruits, you have to really try to overeat fruit. Like like one apple has, depending on the size of the apple, got like 100 calories. So to consume too much calories or excess fructose from apples, you'd have to eat a weird amount of apples. You know what I mean? Or like with watermelon, a pound of watermelon has got like 120 calories. So to have like yeah, like you would have to eat a weird amount of fruit to really run into issues there. And most fruit, not all fruit, but most fruit like apples, oranges, berries are also pretty high in fiber. And fiber is really, really good for you. People who eat a lot of fiber tend to have more beneficial health outcomes, helps you go to the bathroom, which is really good. High fiber intakes can also help reduce cholesterol levels. Fiber also, one, it reduces the rate at which your blood sugar increases after you eat something. So, if I eat an apple, my blood sugar goes up, but what the fiber does, and I'll try not to be too jargony, but it what it does is it slows down gastric emptying, which means the food tends to stay in your stomach longer with the fiber. It kind of slows down the process at which food leaves your stomach, which means the blood sugar, rather than spiking, it is kind of a more gradual increase. And that's also good for mitigating hunger, right? And like I said, for blood sugar control. Whereas if you have fruit juice, the fruit juice doesn't have any of the fiber. So if I drink a glass of fruit juice, that maybe it's got roughly the same amount of calories as the apple, and the same amount of sugar, but none of the fiber, I'm going to see a more rapid like spike in blood sugar. Not that that's necessarily bad per se, but and it's likely not going to satisfy me as much as eating an apple. It's a lot. It would be not that hard for me to consume a lot of calories from apple juice. It's pretty easy to do that. That goes with liquid calories in general, whereas the whole apple, you know what I mean? It takes a lot to over consume that.
I'm going to say something hyperbolic because, I
Yeah,
remember growing up on fruit juice. We were active kids. We were really lucky that way. My parents are amazing. And, okay, fine. But now you kind of look at that. I would rather, because I don't like fruit juice. I'm not really,
Mhm.
I'll eat lots of fruit. I'll have an apple and an orange pretty much every morning. There's berries in my smoothies, etc.
Mhm.
But if I were to one to one choose between, well, okay, I'm going to build in something that has these calories in my diet. I'd rather have a Barks root beer than a glass of apple juice, I'll be honest with you. So I'm going to enjoy the
Sure.
Barks root beer. And I rarely do it. It's not a priority for me, but that's kind of how I look at it. And yes, I'm sort of it's a false equivalency, but in a way, if you're covering all your other nutritional needs that fit your calories, they're probably not that different. Now, I'm not saying to parents, hey, don't give your kids apple juice, give them Barks root beer or Coke. I'm not saying that, but hey, uh, you mentioned blood sugar spikes, on a daily basis for people. So a couple things here. Uh, you've already made it pretty clear that transient elevations and spikes in blood sugar, especially for someone who's in calorie maintenance and is very active, is a non-issue. So what do you think about people wearing glucose monitors, checking the shit daily?
So if I'm going to assume that someone who's doing that doesn't have diabetes, or is
Yes.
not, like, doesn't have pre-diabetes, or is at an immediate risk, or a family member, just someone who wants to do it. In the past, I've been kind of more like, you shouldn't do that. It's pointless. And is it pointless for most people? Kind of. I mean, I don't think there's a huge benefit. Obviously, I think the people who promote it are vastly overstating the benefits. I don't think there's any benefit with regards to fat loss or anything like that. I would say it's kind of like, if someone is just interested in physiology and how their body works, and they have the extra money to spend, and they want to do it, like, go for it. I don't think it will have much of an effect one way or the other. I think the real cons to it: one, it costs money, and two, if someone gets anxiety from, like, oh, it's really low, or oh, it's been really high, and overinterprets things that are kind of not really that important. I think there can be a harm there. So as long as if someone really wants to use it, as long as they know like it's the spikes and lows aren't really all that important, as long as kind of the bigger bricks, that you need in place with your diet, you're eating an appropriate amount of calories, you're getting plenty of exercise, your diet is relatively nutrient dense, yada yada. That's really what matters. So if someone wants to use it and it's like a cool toy for them, sure. But I don't think it's something that will really have a meaningful health benefit to someone, again, unless someone is at a risk or either has diabetes or at risk for it or pre-diabetes. That's different. So I think it's kind of one of these things that a lot of it is just kind of like hype and biohacking bros who want to kind of make something out of nothing and want a way to make money as well.
Okay, so something that hasn't come up, but I think is related to everything we talked about. Another one of the buzzwords people will hear is inflammation. I feel like these things come in waves, and I haven't noticed inflammation being the boogeyman the last year or so, the way it was semi-recently. But I guess I'm comfortable saying that chronic inflammation is a bad thing. But like, is it, itself the driving force, or is it a whole bunch of other behaviors? And like, is inflammation, especially acute inflammation, a problem for people?
So, sort of. So, inflammation, like you said, it is kind of like a buzzword to a large extent. So, really, what it is it's the body's response to a stressor, be it acute or chronic. So, getting sick or getting injured, those are acute stressors, and there's your body's like immune response, so it releases kind of chemicals to fight off the infection or fight off the stressor, or positive stressors such as exercise does create some degree of inflammation. And to some extent, inflammation is a normal body process. And especially acute inflammation is very much a normal response. Like I said, you do exercise, you do really, hard resistance training. In the short term, you are tearing your muscles. You are breaking down your muscles, and there's an inflammatory response that's required to build that up, right? That's good. Or when you get sick, again, you have an inflammatory response. It helps you heal. Or if you have a cut or something like that, there's an inflammatory response that helps with that. Now, chronic inflammation is not good, and it tends to be more of where an acute inflammation is there's kind of a lot all at once and it kind of dissipates. Chronic inflammation is more of kind of like a less extreme but kind of continuous state of inflammation. Usually happens when there's one or more kind of ongoing stressors to the body, like obesity or excess sedentary time or potentially stress or things like that. So chronic inflammation, obviously is not great. Generally, inflammation in the research is measured by things called interleukins and C-reactive proteins. So obviously, it's not good to have that. That being said, it's there are various things that can cause kind of chronic inflammation, and also chronic inflammation kind of cause various things. So I kind of look at it more as sort of a component of like an overall unhealthy lifestyle. And I think because it's a little bit of kind of like a ambiguous term, because like I said, to some extent, inflammation is completely normal. I do think that a lot of coaches or people who sell supplements or whatever oftentimes use like inflammation or anti-inflammation very broadly, to say, oh, this specific food or this specific supplement is anti-inflammatory, or this specific food or this specific component is pro-inflammatory, where it's more so a balance of like a lot of different kind of stressors, if that makes sense. So I could talk more about that, but I don't know if that answered
Well,
your question at all.
it does. We could tease that. I mean, a good example, and even I've at times emphasized this, and I no longer say it to this extent, but we hear about omega-3 being anti-inflammatory and omega-6 being inflammatory, and people being concerned with the ratios of omega-3 to omega-6 in diets.
Yeah,
Is that something people should worry about?
no. So There's actually even so mechanistically, yes, omega-3 is anti-inflammatory, and there are mechanistic there are mechanisms by which omega-6 can be inflammatory, but um it gets to be kind of a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more complicated than that when you look at the literature. In fact, there's actually a decent amount of literature that's not even the ratio so much, but it's that omega-3s and omega-6s are both beneficial, and it's just that omega-3s are even more beneficial. So it's not so much the ratio of those so much, but it's more of just having more omega-3s is good. So and kind of more broadly, I don't think that, hyper focusing on reducing omega-6s will, to any kind of meaningful extent reduce inflammation. I don't think we have data to suggest that. And I don't even think it's necessarily the case that just eating more omega-6s in and of itself will increase inflammation. I think there's a pretty good amount of data, and I've referenced it in one of my seed oil posts that omega-6s in and of themselves are not necessarily like the cause of inflammation. There's mechanisms by which it can contribute, but it's not really quite that simple. So I would say to people, being cognizant of omega-3 intake is important. So omega-3s are a beneficial type of fat, which a lot of people don't get enough of. You largely get it from fish, is kind of your best source, fatty fish. So I think people making an effort to get more omega-3s, be it from fish or be it from supplementation. I'm not a huge supplement guy, but that can be helpful for a lot of people.
The
I
recent
think,
episode with Dr. Alan Bacon, we actually get into
Mhm.
this, and he talks about DHEA and EPA.
Yeah,
And so we actually tackle this really well. So if you guys are actually
yeah.
interested in this specific thing, recent episode, Alan Bacon, there's a whole bunch of supplement stuff there. Awesome episode. You got that.
Yeah, yeah. So, people already know about that. And as for omega-6s, we don't necessarily have data to suggest that they are in and of themselves bad. Now, where there's some nuance to this is that, if people add a lot of fat to their diet, like that's not good. You know what I mean? So I don't think people should go out of their way and to try and eat more omega-6s per se, because we already get enough of it from our diet. But I don't think it's something that's inherently harmful. And in fact, studies that do, and correct me if I get a little bit too jargony here, but studies that do substitution analyses. So basically, they look at all this data and they kind of tease out, okay, if people replace this nutrient with that nutrient while keeping everything else constant, what happens? It's kind of a complicated statistical approach, but actually replacing things like saturated fat with omega-6 actually results in beneficial health outcomes. So I don't think that, I think omega-6 fats are something that's been vilified, and it's not necessarily something that needs to be, and it doesn't necessarily follow. It doesn't follow that omega-6s necessarily cause chronic inflammation. I would say more so it's, obesity, sedentary lifestyles, chronic stress, an unhealthful diet, which would basically be a diet that's very low in like fruits and vegetables and stuff like that, is more so kind of what kind of contributes to that chronic inflammation. The last thing I'll say is in research, there is something called the Dietary Inflammatory Index. It's not perfect, but they use it to look at overall diet patterns and whether a particular diet pattern is more likely to cause chronic inflammation. And that is really the key here. It's not one food or one ingredient that necessarily causes chronic inflammation. It's a sum of a whole bunch of different dietary factors and lifestyle factors that play a role here. So hopefully it wasn't too jargony, and hopefully that makes sense.
I'm pretty confident people will be okay with that one. And
Yeah.
I was going to ask you what people should do if they're concerned with chronic inflammation, but I think you kind of said, all right, here are all the things. So if you actually like actively work against those things, I think regular cardiovascular and resistance training are probably two of the best tools.
Yep.
I'm guessing jumping in a cold plunge is not going to be the thing.
I don't think so. No, I don't think we have data to support that. I'm not against cold plunges or cold showers. As long as you're not doing them right after resistance training, because that can
Mm.
blunt muscle protein synthesis. But as long as you're not doing it like soon after resistance training, have common sense and you don't get like frostbite or anything, like I'm not against it. And this is an area of research I'm not as familiar with, but cold exposure does at least acutely reduce inflammation. So that's kind of where the idea of icing injuries, I think, comes from. So I'm not opposed to that. If someone likes doing it, it wakes them up, that's fine. But yeah, for chronic inflammation, it's the effect of a cold plunge would be more acute. So really doing kind of obvious, boring things. So, like you said, regular cardiovascular and resistance training, eating a healthy diet, lots of fruits, vegetables, healthy fats, which I would say would be largely like your plant-based fats and limiting saturated fat, and limiting very kind of sugary foods or fried foods and eating a diet that's got a lot of vitamins and minerals, fiber, etc. Sleeping enough, managing stress, etc. That's, if you're worried about chronic inflammation, it's those tenets that really matter.
Probably in a cold pool this weekend. So
Yeah.
I'm recording this. It'll have happened by the time people listen.
Yeah.
But a good friend of mine, his name is Matt Manti, and he's the owner of a gym called the Armory in Didsbury. I got to give Matt and Joanne, his assistant coach, a big shout. They're wonderful people. So they had me come out and do a talk for their 1 year anniversary of rebrand last year in January. It was
Mhm.
like minus 40 Celsius outside. And then we're in the Nordic Spa, which is like hot and cold pools outside.
Yeah.
And I was like, this sounds insane, but it was actually wonderful. And then I will probably end up with a cold pool a touch. I will be in the warm ones a lot. Let's put it this
Yeah.
way this weekend. And Lee Boyce is going to be there. So my buddy Lee Boyce, any listeners who
Yeah.
know Lee, he's coming in as well. But I was just, and I'm going to say this like in all seriousness, but sort of humorously, is like I remember I've been in two cold plunges in my life, and both times it involved a very beautiful female, you know, friend of mine. Uh, so that's what got me into those situations. So that's
Yeah.
that's the extent of what will get me doing cold plunges. And you point out the key thing as well is it definitely has it may interfere with the positive acute inflammation post
Right.
exercise. And so I'll go a little further on that. If you hear about like LeBron James sometimes gets talked about using cold therapy, cryo type stuff in season. So in athletes who play things like, basketball, hockey, etc., they play multiple games, usually like one every second day, one every third day, sometimes back-to-back nights. They manage injuries, and so they deal with this sort of inflammation. And during season, they're not trying to make adaptations to be stronger or build muscle. They're basically
Right.
trying to manage pain and be able to continue to get on the court. Like the old Kobe Bryant belief, well, and I think it was Kobe. There, I think other people have said it too. It's like, hey, that one game that I might sit out might be the one game that some fans, family planned and could afford to come and attend, and I'm not
Right.
going to play. No. So like Kobe's mindset was he was going to do no matter what with injuries, he was going to play if he could. So yeah. Anyway, that's a bit of an extreme example, but I've never been the one who's been, hey, I got to go get a cold plunge and get outside. It's cold. Listen, I get enough cold exposure in the winter here living in Edmonton,
Yeah.
Alberta anyway, so I'll
Yeah, I can
pass on
imagine.
voluntarily jumping into ice buckets. Forget that shit.
Yeah.
All right. Do I have anything else for you? I think we've kind of knocked down everything. You did have a post. We can do this one quickly. You listed daily minimum dietary fat recommendations. And obviously, people have a lot of different beliefs about fats. Why is dietary fat important? And how much should people be getting? And what forms matter?
Right. Okay. So, and I'm going to go back to, we were just talking about omega-3s and omega-6s. So certain types of dietary fat, specifically omega-3 and omega-6, are essential. So if a nutrient is essential, that means your body can't synthesize it and you have to get it from externally, from food or supplements or what have you. So if you ate literally no fat and you got literally no omega-3s and omega-6s, you would eventually die. I mean, we're all going to die eventually, but you would, so obviously you have to have some level of fat there. And more practically speaking, eating a very, very low fat diet is not going to be healthy. It can, among other things, increase the risk of gallstones. You will, like I said, you need to get, your essential fatty acids. You need some fat to absorb fat soluble vitamins. So that's vitamins A, D, E, and K. And fat is also, it's a part of cell membranes. So you need it for that as well. And maybe most pertinent to your listeners is that fat is also important for sex hormones, so estrogen, testosterone, etc. So we do have, a certain amount of fat that we have to have just to survive and also live optimally. Now, as for what that minimum is, this is something that does vary from individual to individual. So I think people should be careful when I kind of give these numbers. Um, as far as minimizing gallstone risk, you don't need much, 12-ish grams per day, ballpark. Should be able to mitigate your risk there. As for omega-3s and omega-6s, obviously, I don't think anyone needs to supplement with omega-6s because they're pretty widely present in our diet. Like, we alluded to, going out of your way to get some omega-3s, be it supplements or fish, etc., is good. Usually like 20-ish grams per day is sufficient to get your essential, omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids, with fat soluble vitamins. So again, that's your vitamins A, D, E, and K. To some extent, ideally you would have a little bit of fat with your meals that contain those vitamins, or supplementation. Although, if you've had fat like a little while before, you still have some, dietary fat that you're digesting that will help with that. I would say generally, if you're getting at least 20-ish grams per day of overall fat for the most part, you should be good there with your fat soluble vitamin absorption. I would say kind of the biggest thing that people might run into if they are maybe following like a really low calorie diet and they're taking a lot of the calories away from fats, especially, I think of like physique competitors, right? Where they are really, cutting down would be the fat that you need for your sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, etc. Again, this will vary. Like I said, all these numbers will vary from person to person. I would say if you're getting at least 40 grams per day of fat, you should be in a good spot there. Again, this kind of varies depending on the individual. You could also go by percent of total calories. So generally speaking, I would say, getting at least 20% of your overall calories from fat is a good recommendation. Now, there's certain instances where, for, like I said, for folks who are like physique competitors, which, if you're a physique competitor, it's not like a healthful, you're not doing it for like optimal health. Obviously, there's going to be some period where you might go a bit lower than that. So, the very bottom floor, 15%, but habitually, I would say 20% of your calories, roughly, for as a minimum for most people, or roughly, I would say 40 grams per day. For folks who are like really who have like lower energy needs, so maybe like a woman with like a very small frame who might not have very high energy needs, they might not need that full 40 grams per day. So I might go with more of that 20%. So, kind of a long-winded way of saying most people should try and get at least 20% of their diet from dietary fats.
And if someone's saying like, ooh, 40 grams sounds like a lot. Well, there's 9 calories per gram of fat. So my math's right here. We got 360 calories a day at that recommendation. So that's not a lot of calories, I would hope, right?
Right. It should be, again, unless we're talking about cases of, dieting where someone has like a very low energy expenditure, unless you're in that case, where it's like you need every calorie that you can get, it shouldn't be that hard to reach that kind of minimum fat recommendation. And again, I'll say it again, these numbers do vary depending on the person. And it's not like if you get less than this for one day, like your testosterone is going to drop to zero or you're going to like blow up. You know what I mean? It's more so kind of chronic intakes that I'm talking about here.
Everybody, Dan Feldman, the powerlifting dietitian. You can follow at powerlifter dietitian,
Powerlifter
right?
dietitian. Yep.
Any other resources you want people to check out?
Yeah, I mean, really, Instagram is the best spot for me. I do have an email list. I try to email roughly once per week, and I send out summaries of like new research. I try and make them somewhat like kind of layman summaries and without a ton of words of new research that I've read. I do it usually every week or every other week. And at the end of each email, I do a one-liner from a stand-up comedian just to kind of spice things up. So if you're interested in that, that is the link to that is the link in my bio on my Instagram profile at Powerlifter Dietitian.
Yours is sensational. This is an awesome, enlightening. I think it hits the tone of what I'm trying to bring forward with these episodes. Obviously, I know a lot of my coach friends are still listening. You guys are incredible. But if you are, a little bit newer to this, and you haven't like posted on your social media yet, tag me. I love that. Please do. It helps me. I'm trying to put a big blast of these. I'm giving you guys 2 a week for a while. We'll see. I'll definitely settle into 1 a week at some point, but for now, 2 a week. And I just want to get these in more people's hands. So I also want you guys to message me. Let me know what you think. I want to hear from you guys. Good feedback, bad feedback. It's kind of funny. There's someone that commented, I don't even know who this was, and they complained that I talk too much in one of the episodes because these are often dialogues with my friends. And I'm just like,
Right.
that hurts my soul. But it's like, okay, cool. I'll take it as honest feedback.
Well,
It's like, have you never listened to a fucking podcast before? Oh my
yeah,
God, right?
yeah,
Plus, like my family sit around and listen to these, and so I think they want to hear me at least a little bit. So, but
yeah.
actually, no, I try to give the floor at least 70 to 80% to my guests, and this was perfect day. So, everybody listening, your honest, genuine feedback, if you like it, share it with the people who you think, hey, this is going to really help your life. And I can't wait to share the next episode with you. Stay tuned.